This video will cover R functions and exceptions. By the end of this video, you should understand what a function in R is, what function arguments, return values, and side effects are, what an exception is in R, and what the two types of exceptions in R actually are, and what they mean. So before we discuss functions in R, let's talk about functions in general. In mathematics, what does a function do? So think about some kind of function, f of x. We usually would write it out as y equals f of x. What does this mean? What's happening here is a function takes a value or values from x and then maps them to exactly one value. Here we're going to call that y. The mathematical definition of functions is intentionally very broad. Anything that converts some input into an output can be thought as a function. So for example, all of the items purchased and their prices could be converted by a function into your final grocery bill. The scores on all of your assignments in a course could be converted into a final letter grade. Or in a context that might be a little more familiar to data scientists, copious weather data could be converted into the predicted path of a hurricane. R functions are very similar to mathematical functions. A function is going to take a value or a set of values provided as what we're going to call arguments. It's then going to apply that function to those values and return the resulting value, set of values, or an object. R functions might also possibly have side effects, which is a little different from mathematical functions. So let's look at this in detail. In this slide, I've written out the max function in R. What that does is it looks at all of the arguments and returns the largest of them. So first, the important thing here is the function. I have that highlighted in green. That's the max part. Next, you need to provide it a set of information. These are the arguments. So those are all inside of parentheses and separated by commas, one argument between each set of commas. This function is then going to return a value. This would be the output in the R console. I've highlighted that here. 4 is the largest of the arguments that I gave, so the max function would return 4. Sometimes these functions might return many values. Sometimes they might return something more complicated like an object. And again, lastly, functions might have side effects. I'll show you an example of a function that has a side effect in a minute, but that means the function is doing something more than just returning a value. So again, R functions are similar to mathematical functions. They're going to map arguments to a result in a predefined way. R functions are a little different from mathematical functions though. Again, firstly, R functions can have side effects. A good example of a function with side effects is the view function in R with a capital V. What that does is it actually opens up a new window in RStudio and lets you look at something. So rather than just returning a value or a set of values, it changes the environment of RStudio. Secondly, R functions can be non-deterministic. And one example is the runIf function. If you don't believe me, you can run this function from the command line several times. What I mean by non-deterministic is every time you run this function, you get a different value. This is unlike functions that you're familiar with in mathematics, in that it's not mapping a single value to a single predefined output value. It's much more like a random variable if you take in statistics. I will say there are ways to make these functions deterministic, but by default, the runIf function, which is a random number generator, is not deterministic. The other component that I'd like to talk about here are exceptions. So when R encounters some kind of a problem in the code that it's given, it generates an exception. There are two types of exceptions. The first is a warning. A warning is when R encounters something troublesome or unexpected in a statement, but it can continue processing the statement. When that happens, you're going to see in the console a message with warning before it. The second type of exception is an error. When R returns an error exception, that means it encountered a statement it couldn't process. Then it's going to put a message in the console with error at the beginning, and it's going to stop trying to execute that statement. When this happens, no result is going to be returned from the expression. As a bit of a warning, with R, even if it encounters an error, your script may continue running. This can actually lead to many error messages because when you encounter an error exception, nothing is returned, and that can lead to cases where part of your code is expecting something that it never gets. So when you encounter an error exception, it's a good idea to scroll through the console and take a look back to see exactly where the first error you encountered is, because the original error might have occurred way before your script stopped. So as a general rule in R, error messages are always bad. You should never encounter error exceptions in well-functioning code, but you may receive benign warning messages. Sometimes you might receive a warning message that warns you that certain functionality in your package has been deprecated and is going to be removed in future versions. That's just warning that you might need to update your code in the future. There are other types of benign warning messages too that are just telling you that something might be amiss or not as expected. But an error always means that something didn't happen the way R expected it to.